stuff in that package. Mr. Geoff Kelley is our keynote speaker, and I know I have some notes here that I'm supposed to talk about. Well, I've known Geoff for years, and we first met playing ball hockey, I think, some time ago. Geoff certainly has made his name on the political scene here in Quebec. He was the MNA for Jacques Cartier for close to 30 years. 24. Who's counting? As Stephen referred to, he got to hand over the reins to his son, right, who's going to continue in his way. His family has always been involved very much in education. His spouse sits on the Lester B. Pearson School Board as a commissioner. He's been a teacher as well. Geoff is a former, professor of history at McGill University. And he's been, quite the fatherly figure, if I say so myself, on the Quebec political scene for the English-speaking community. And quite frankly, he is a personal friend, but one of the finest people I know. So without further ado, Mr. Geoff Kelley.
Well, thank you very much, Linton, for that introduction. We did meet only about 45 years ago, but who's counting? But Linton and I go way, way back, and we have many memories. Some of them we can even share with you at some point. And Linton also did a very good job of introducing the various people in the room, so consider all of you greeted and very much. I can say dear friends because I see so many people in the room, friendly faces, so it's very nice to be back at a QFHSA meeting. And Stephen, for the math, I understand your problem with math because my eldest daughter recently turned 38 and I'm only 39. So at this rate, she's going to be older than her father, which I just don't know biologically how that quite works, but there you go. What I thought I would do, because obviously there is a very dark cloud on the horizon in Quebec right now called Bill 40, which will fundamentally change how our schools are governed and the participation of the English-speaking community in the control and management of its schools. These are fundamental issues. These are things that we should be taking our time to looking at. We have a government that sort of wants to make as its trademark to do things quickly, to say we're going to do this, so we're going to go ahead and do it. Doing things quickly is not necessarily a guarantee of doing things well. And I think last week has been eloquent proof that if you do things too quickly, you make terrible mistakes. And I think we all watched with certain horror the whole issue of the PEQ, which was the program to help accelerate foreign students into becoming landed immigrants and eventually citizens of Canada. And the whole thing was so badly mishandled, they had to keep withdrawing. It got to such an absurd level that a woman from France studying at Laval said her French wasn't good enough to live in Quebec. So go figure. Sometimes reality kills fiction. It's very hard to make that kind of stuff up, but that's the kind of situation we're in. Bill 40, so what I'll do is tell you a little bit of the story of where APPELLE came from, our origins, and the recent developments, as Stephen referred to it, with my vice chairs, Joan Fraser, the former editor of the Gazette, former senator, and Kevin Shar, who is a young lawyer from Gatineau, who has two daughters in an English public school in Gatineau. We went up and presented a brief, but I want to tell you a little bit of the background of how we got there. A number of the groups that are represented in this room after the election of the CAQ government in October of last year were very concerned about the future of our school boards. So formed a group called APPELLE. I see Geoffrey Chambers and Sylvia Martin-Laforge who are here, Dan Lamoureux as well from the QESBA, and other groups, obviously Carol Mandel and Linton from Home and School. Renata's been there as well, and perhaps on behalf of the retired educators. So a broad group that got together and started to debate what strategies we should do, what should we do. And they delegated Dan and his executive director, Russell Copeman, and Geoffrey Chambers and Sylvia to come and see me to see if I would chair this thing. And of course, my first answer was no, because I'm very happily retired, and I want to make sure everyone realizes that I'm very happily retired. There's a very nice white chair in our music room. I can sit there for hours reading books, looking out the window, enjoying my grandchildren. So I said, thanks, but no thanks. But those 4 people are very persistent. So they took me out for another coffee and then another coffee and obviously the advantage they had was, I believe firmly in the role school boards play in our society. I believe firmly in local democracy. So the issue that's before us today is one that's very important. I believe that keeping the link between school administration and volunteers such as yourself is something that's very important and is something that has made the success that our schools, our public schools are. I am a graduate of an English public school. My 5 children are graduates of English public schools. My 2 grandchildren of the 4 are already enrolled in an English public school. So it's something in our family we believe in very deeply. So Geoffrey and Russell in particular wore me down, so eventually I agreed to chair APPELLE, and it's been a great pleasure for me to do it. And we had our first meetings, I think, in March of this year, announced more formally the creation of APPELLE in April, and our first fear was that the government might table legislation before the House rose in June of this year. So we immediately went to work. And I'm not a huge fan of it, but the first thing we did is we commissioned some polls. We thought, maybe people are sick and tired of school boards. Maybe this argument that school boards are no good has made some progress in the English-speaking community. So, well, let's go out and test the idea. Polls are polls, and there's sort of something, someone calls you up while you're cooking dinner and you answer a few questions. So how scientific they are, I'll leave that to somebody else. But I'll have to admit, I don't know whether you agree, Geoffrey, I was agreeably surprised by the high rate of support English school boards got on these polls. I thought, well, we got around 60, 70%, we're in a good number there, and but the numbers, many of them were in 80s. One of them, I think, hit 90% support for various aspects of the rights of the English-speaking community to have a say in how their schools are managed, in the support for school boards, in the trust they had in school boards. So it was a very encouraging result. So that was sort of the first step we did. As you all know, the legislation wasn't tabled in June, so some of the preparatory work we did, it gave us even more time. And to his credit, the minister agreed to meet with 7 of us on the 12th of August in his riding office down in Chambly. So we went down on a beautiful sunny day. And I have to say the meeting was very cordial. And we made a lot of points. He presented to us his version of how he saw these new service centers operating, which would have sounded an awful lot like the proposal that was in the Liberal government's Bill 86, which was an appointed board with different categories. And if you've ever looked at how a CEGEP board is named, it was a little bit the same kind of model. Representatives of teachers, a couple of socioeconomics, someone from the financial sector, but the minister, the government would name the people who would sit on these service centers. And we said, that's not good enough. There has to be a community voice. His second, and we had a very important difference of opinion, he wanted to define the English-speaking community as parents with children in school today. Well, I'm still a parent. Apparently that's sort of a lifetime commitment as far as I understand. Anyway, the children may not live at home, although they're often sleeping at home, and father is always an ATM. That part I've understood, and that seems to never change. So for the younger parents out there, sorry to disappoint you, but the whole ATM thing will go on for a long time into the future. And I love them all. So we had, I think, a strong divergence of opinion on who is the English-speaking community. And we stressed once again the importance of parents, of people like you who spend some of your time as volunteers working in our schools, connecting our education to your own volunteer time, making sure that our young people get the best possible chance to succeed in life. But the minister took a lot of notes. He's a very younger than I am, very modern, so he was there with his laptop, hammering notes, but it was, I think, safe to say it was a cordial meeting, and he agreed to get back with us. So we went away with that. You never know, you can have lots of meetings. I've been on the other side of the table as a minister, so sometimes you listen and nod very politely, and then say, well, I can't do any of that, so then you move on. But the minister seemed to be quite willing to think about what he had heard. So the next big step was October the 1st. Some of us in the room, we gathered around the big table at the QFHSA head offices, and someone emailed us the little document called Bill 40, which is something that looks like this, that runs to, I can't remember, several hundred articles of law. And for all of you who've ever tried to do the exercise, reading a bill is hard work. Because all you have here are the amendments, but you don't have the Education Act or the Quebec School Election Act that is changed by all of this. So you're always trying to, well, this is changed by doing that. Well, what does that mean? Then you have to go back to the Education Act. It's not easy work. And so we all sat around the big table all afternoon, drinking coffee, reading, a couple of lawyers in the room, a couple of lawyers on the phone, trying to wade through all of this. What does it mean? What does it mean? And I will say that our reaction was a bit mixed, because following that meeting on the 12th of August, the minister was at least willing to entertain the possibility for a different system on the English side than on the French side. The French side, I'll leave it to the Fédération des Commissions Scolaires, but for them it's really the end of their school boards, it's the end of any form of election. There are people that will be appointed by that kind of formula that I described. On the English side, there was an opening to do things a little bit differently, and there would still be elections. So we looked at that, and that opening, that sort of asymmetrical approach, if you want to call it that, well, that was a bit encouraging. But then we started to understand on two levels how this would all work. And it's very important because there are there are deep issues about the Canadian Constitution and the linguistic minority rights. So there's a legal argument, but there was also just a very practical, can this thing work? Can this dog hunt, if you will? Which were some of our questions as well. So I'll take them each in turn. I'm not trying to say one is more important than the other, but we were looking at it, and as it stands, Bill 40 is so complicated that even dedicated parents like you are in this room and all of us in this room, just to figure out how to vote is going to be a very complicated thing under the rules as they're set out in Bill 40. So maybe I'll start first on some of our practical concerns. I'll come back to some of the deeper, important constitutional legal issues, all of this, but maybe I'll take it in that order. Because one of the commitments we took with the minister is we're willing to be part of the solution. We're willing to try to find ways to improve Bill 40. And that was a bit of a dilemma, because there were lots of people who told us, forget it, Bill 40, it's just such a mess, go to court right away. And this is an argument I've had in the past in my former life. It's easy to say, let's go to court, go to court. That's a commitment of $1 million, $2 million, $3 million that I think we all know our schools could use that kind of money. So to me, going to court is really the last recourse if we've exhausted any other procedures, anything else that we can do to try to find a political solution. This is legislation, this is a political debate, this is a political problem. And before rushing to court, which is a huge financial commitment, I'd like to be able to say at the end of the day, and our APPELLE members agree, we tried everything we could to make something workable out of Bill 40. So that was our dilemma, because I said we had lots of advice to the contrary. People just said, hire your lawyers, write your thing, and away we go. Of course, that's a decision that would only be taken after the legislation is adopted anyway, because you can't sue on the basis of a bill because it hasn't been adopted yet. So we're not at the final steps anyway, but it's a very important question, and I put it to you, and when we have an exchange after my remarks are over, if you have any comments on that, but our approach is we'll do our very best to try to fix this process. So what are our problems with Bill 40? Why do we think Bill 40, as it currently stands, can never work? There are a few areas. I think the first one is simply a question of the composition of the new boards of these service centers, because service centers will be placed on the territory of the 9 existing English school boards. They'll be called service centers as opposed to boards, and we'll get onto their powers in just a minute. But in the bill, it says that they can be from 8 to 17 parents on the board, 4 community representatives, and 4 representatives of the staff. So a teacher rep, an administrator rep, a support staff rep. So you would have a board that I think the biggest potential one would be on the territory we're on in Lester B. Pearson, where it would be something like 12 parents, 4 community reps, and 4 staff reps. So you'd have a board of 20 with the parents representing 60% of the board, which is unlike all the other instances in government where there's a parity between, like a governing board is 50% parents, 50% representatives of the community. So it is curious that we abandon the notion of the parity between the parents and the other representatives. Secondly, for the parent representatives, there's another obligation that you also must sit on a governing board. And we all know governing boards, if you do it seriously, if you do it appropriately, already eats up into your time. If I add on to it, and given the distances in many of our school boards, a service center meeting at least once a month, that's asking an awful lot for parents on a voluntary basis, because no longer will these positions be with the huge salaries. And full disclosure, my wife is a school commissioner, as Linton said, and she does make the munificent sum of $7,500 a year. And I can assure you she earns every penny of it, if not more. So, if we're doing all of this to save the taxpayers $7,500, I think we're going in the wrong direction. But there's full disclosure. Any of you can say that Mr. Kelley did admit that his wife is a school commissioner. So I think to do all of that on a voluntary basis is something that it's a lot to ask for parents. And I think already some of the echoes from groups like APPELLE and others that it's going to be very difficult to find that many motivated parents. And I ask, why the requirement that you must simultaneously sit on the governing board? I have a problem with that. If it's an interested parent, I think having a role for parents on our boards is something that's very important. But I think the double requirement limits the field of people willing to do it. And I think our challenge is going to be finding enough people to assume these roles without making it too complicated. On the community rep side, it's even more complicated, because you will have to be elected on a territory-wide basis. So as opposed to having a ward or a district or a particular area, you'll have to campaign. Now, in Lester B. Pearson, the school board I know best, runs from Verdun to the Ontario border. So it's already fairly sizable, but it's one of the little guys. When you get to Western Quebec, you go from Gatineau to Val-d'Or. Eastern Quebec, the Central Quebec school boards have immense territory. So how, for a volunteer position, to be a community rep, I could campaign across a broad area like that? Inevitably, and I'm not saying bad will, I always pick on poor old Western Quebec when I use this example, but if I'm a community rep from Val-d'Or who wants to get on the service center board because I believe Indigenous education, which is very important at the Golden Valley School in Val-d'Or, well, most of the people who will be voting live in Gatineau. So, I don't know this guy from Val-d'Or, but the guy down the street who's running is not a bad sort, so I'm going to vote for him or her. I think it's just a natural reflex. So you'll tend to have the people elected to represent the community where the concentration of people are. So whether it's Quebec City for the Central Quebec School Board, whether it's around Gatineau for the Western Quebec Service Center, or whatever it's going to be called. So that's complicated. And I think having your community rep should come from a community and not from the vast territories that are represented. Secondly, and again, this is a criteria that might work in an appointed board, there are subcategories. So those 4 community reps, one has to be 18 to 35, one has to have a background in governance, one has to have a background in finance, and one has to come from the community sector, health sector, education sector, their whole list. Not all that well defined to begin with. What is expertise in governance? Do you have to have a certificate from Concordia or McGill, or I don't know how you prove it. But does it mean that as a voter, I'd have to vote in 4 categories? Because there's no way I can guarantee an 18 to 35-year-old is going to win the election unless I have an 18 to 35-year-old category, right? Because people may just all vote for the older people, or they all vote for the younger people. We don't know. So how you ensure that these subcategories we represented, and being a bit of a mischievous at times, if I'm a 28-year-old accountant who works for a hospital, can I run in 3 categories? I don't know, but it seems to me, and beyond being silly about it, the important thing is to keep both, for the electors and the candidates, to keep things as universal as possible. That anyone who is in the English-speaking community can vote, anyone who's in the English-speaking community can run. That should be the basic principle. And that each time we make that more complicated, compromises the universal right to participate in the control and management from the English-speaking community. So it's a really, really important principle that's here. So all these subcategories and all that need to be taken out. And if you're a motivated parent and you want to run for one of those positions as a parent, you should be able to do it. And if you're a community rep from your community, so our suggestions to the minister and to the committee last week, let's try to simplify this. I still think, and I leave it to the experts to figure out how this could be done, but as a future elector in a service center election, I think it'd be a lot easier if I showed up and I had 2 ballots. I had 1 ballot for the parent rep, and I had 1 ballot for my community rep, and the community rep would come from a specific part of the territory served. So the people in Val-d'Or or the northern part of the Western Quebec School Board would have a representative. There'd be representatives from Gatineau. There'd be the different areas covered by that. You'd make sure that in Lester B. Pearson, there'd be, because there's always the dichotomy between the off-island, the people in Vaudreuil-Soulanges, and the people on the island of Montreal. You'd make sure that the community reps would equally come from both sides of the equation. I think that's something that's very important, and it's simple. I show up, I'm given 2 ballots, because one of the things we have to do, and no one's going to defend the current turnout in our elections, it's about 17%, I think the last time, we have to do better. But one of the ways you do it better is you have to make a voting process that's easier for people to participate in and not more complicated. And 18 to 35 and governance and yada, yada, yada. I get lost trying to figure out how on November 1st of next year that would work. And being an old guy, I also have a bit of a memory. And I don't know how many of you remember in the room the first year that we had elections for the linguistic school boards in 1998. It was a fiasco to a point that, as a legislator, we were forced, between the day of the advance poll on a Sunday and the following Sunday, which was the day of the elections, to amend the Quebec School Election Act because it was such a mess. I don't want to see that happen again on November the 1st. People didn't know who were on the list. People didn't know where to go. It was really, and ultimately the Director General of Elections of the day lost his job. It was that bad. It was a real, so one of our advice to the minister and to his team, go back and read what happened in June of 1998. It doesn't make for pretty reading, but it is a reality that we have to remember. And I think at least I gave him that advice. We'll see what he does with it. Secondly, we all know, and mea culpa, because I was once part of the government, the electoral lists as they currently stand are a mess. They're inaccurate, they're out of date. There were all sorts of anomalies in the past where it happened even in our own house, when our youngest daughter graduated from high school, suddenly we became Francophones. You know, well, no, we were still connected with the English school system and all the rest, so we had to make a gesture to be returned back onto the English list, despite the fact we were no longer parents with children in school, but we were still parents, I'm pretty sure. So there were anomalies like that. Until recently, there were differential rates whether you were an Anglophone or Francophone when it came to paying school taxes. Well, once your kids aren't in school anymore, and it was cheaper to be a Francophone, or in some areas it was cheaper to be an Anglophone, you'd join the other list, save a couple $100 a year, why not? Well, we're all human nature and that's the way things go. So you have all those crossovers in the past. So one of the things we told the government, and I think they should mandate the DGEQ, before transferring the responsibility for the first service center elections, they have an enormous job to try to fix these lists. And I can say politely, good luck, because it will not be something easy to do. But if you don't do it, we'll repeat 1998. People will show up at their school or their town, city hall to vote. They won't be on a list, people will be looking, people will be angry, and it won't be a very pretty scene. So I think it's one of the things, and I was very pleased the current Director General of Elections, Pierre Reid, testified, I think, Tuesday before the committee in the National Assembly, deploring this is a huge step back for local democracy. He's someone who said he had hoped we would come up with a proposal to improve local participation, local democracy on the school level. So Pierre Reid and the DGEQ went on record to saying Bill 40 is a huge step backward. So it was nice to hear from him on a broader level, not just on the issues specific to the English-speaking community, that Bill 40 is a step backwards. So thank you very much, Pierre Reid, but I hate to turn over to you a hot potato, but before having these first service center elections, there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to make these lists. And as I say, I don't know how simple it's going to be. The other recommendation we made is these service center boards should be made up of elected people. So the 4 staff representatives, they have other ways of communicating with the Director General. If they're teachers, they're unionized. If they're support staff, they're unionized. The administrators have their own bodies where they can make sure that their concerns are heard. So ideally, I would see a board, a service center board. Half of the people would be community reps, whether it's 6 or 8. Half of them would be parent reps. They would all be elected by universal suffrage. I think it's something simple. I think it's people can understand. So when you go to vote on November 1st of next year, vote early and often. No, the often, you're not supposed to do that. You can do it, but you're just not supposed to say it. But just to go out and to make it as voter-friendly as possible. Because we all agree that it's very important to have more participation. No one's going to argue that. Now, I think 4 years ago, Marlene Jennings was asked to head up a committee, and she came up with a long series of suggestions on how we could improve voter turnout. Are there ways of voting online? I'm not an expert on this stuff, but are there ways of voting online? Are there ways, apparently in some provinces they even vote by mail. Is it possible to twin them with the municipal elections? Many other provinces vote for both municipalities and school boards on the same day. Well, let's try it. And it's an idea that's been kicking around for a long time, but sometimes the school board world had cold feet, sometimes the municipal world had cold feet, but I think if we're trying to encourage local democracy, if we're trying to make sure that for people like you in the room, that your voice is heard on questions fundamental to our future as a society, that is the education of our children, let's try it. We'll give it a shot. There's no harm in trying once, and then we can evaluate the results, but 17% isn't enough. The fact that too many positions were won by acclamation isn't necessarily a healthy sign either. It's more fun being in elections when you win them. I can attest to that. But still in all, I think these are important positions. We also said they should be paid, modest sums, but the community believes that the work these people are doing is important. So if you get something more, I think the current proposal is they'll give you $100 a meeting. Well, particularly if you look at the long distances that some people be traveling, it's not, it's just, this is, either you decide it's important work or it isn't important work. And if you decide that it's important work, some recognition in the form of a salary or a stipend, as I say, not millions of dollars, that's not what I'm arguing for, but I think some recognition that these people are doing important work is important. Now, it was interesting because in our presentation on November 6th, we made the point that we think that for parents in particular, this double requirement to be on a governing board and all the rest is going to be very hard to find people, and it'll be a real deterrent. And I think, sort of in tennis terms, the minister made an unforced error in his answer to me, because he said, oh, don't worry, because these service centers won't just be decision makers, they'll just make sure that the decision-making process was done appropriately. Well, wrong. The Constitution guarantees a question of control and management. So you're not just there to rubber stamp decisions that have been taken by other people. You are there to make debates and make decisions as a service, as a school board today and as a service center in the future. So I thought it was an interesting argument that he made. Oh, don't worry about the parents because they're not going to be doing much anyway. Well, it's not a very strong argument, and certainly to my right was sitting a lawyer, and he was very excited by that answer. Because one of the things you do, and I'll sort of start segueing into the next thing, is when you go to court, you are always looking at the mystical thing of the intention of the legislator. What was the legislator meaning? What did the legislator want to do when he drafted the bill the way he drafted the bill? So that kind of quote informs that kind of debate one day if it ever goes that far. So it was an answer I wasn't expecting, but as I say, the lawyers are happy with me now. So another curious exchange was with the and I'm not trying to make this partisan because I believe in school boards, period, and many of these same arguments I had with my own colleagues in my own caucus prior to 2018. But one of the arguments from the CAC M&As was, well, we want to depoliticize the whole school governance. Like politics is evil. Well, I was a politician for 24 years, and modestly speaking, I'm proud of what I did. I'm proud of politics because there's politics everywhere in our lives all the time. There are politics in the office. Kate, you could probably say in a university department on time, a little bit, Kate, no, please. A little bit of politics. In a sporting association, does Johnny or Jane make the A team or the B team? In Beaconsfield, where I live, one father who was a lawyer took the Lakeshore Hockey Association to court, cost all the parents thousands of dollars to defend the fact that Johnny was on the B team, not on the A team. So to say we're going to depoliticize things, politics is quite simple. Politics is making choices and being accountable for those choices to the population. Because no matter where you are, there are always more projects than there's money available. So politicians, governments will be always deciding things. Which school gets renovations this summer? Which school gets its gym refurbished? Which school gets extra resources because they have students with special needs? These are all the kind of decisions you have to take all the time. And I prefer to see those made by a board that is between the school. The school has a very important role to play, but someone has to be between Quebec City and the school to look at a territory and say, well, that school's struggling a little bit, so with the discretionary powers and measures and budgets that I have, let's give that school a little bit of an extra hand this year because it needs it. So I think that medium role, the middle role between the two is very important, and school boards currently have the power to make those sort of discretionary decisions or move around with ratios in the classroom, because if you have 5 or 6 students that are in very difficult or have specific special needs, well, I can lower the class ratio there to make sure, so a couple of the classes in the rest of the school or somewhere in another school might be a little bit bigger to make sure that we can provide special services for those particularly challenged students. I think there is a need for that role between the two to make sure that across a territory, students are given as equal a chance as possible. And that's why I think you can call it a school board, you can call it a service center, but I think it's very important that it has that power to do those sort of things. If the service center is just there, service center to me, the first time I heard the expression, I must admit I thought of gas stations, You go and you get pumped up and away you go, and maybe you get your windshield cleaned or something. That to me is a service center, but we won't go into a quarrel over that. But I think it's important to look at the powers. And there's even an editorial in La Presse this morning. Most of it I disagree with, in the sense that he's supporting the minister and getting rid of school boards, and school boards have overlived their use. But at the end, he does make an important point that subtly in the bill, there are lots of areas where much of the decision power goes back to the minister in Quebec City. So something as simple but highly symbolic as what these new simple service centers will be called, the naming of them, the minister decides. Well, no. These are our institutions that we've built up, so I think it should be up to the service centers to choose their own norm. He can change the territories. He can abolish a service center. There are all sorts of other things. He can force service centers to do agreements together. There are a number of powers that, in the name of decentralization, he will pull back to Quebec City. So it's a bit of a contradiction in terms. It's one of the few points I agree with in the editorial in La Presse this morning, that there is a form of power grab in this as well. Now, Carol just recently drew to my attention another thing, that there are, in the current Education Act, students are entitled to receive spiritual counseling, and community engagement. So there's an entitlement for the student to receive that and an obligation for the school boards to provide it in 2 articles that are now struck out of the bill. So what the consequences of all that is, I don't quite know, and it's something we will undertake, Carol, to find out more about, because those community liaison officers or those people that offer spiritual animation, if the requirement is taken out of the Education Act, I don't know enough about the funding formulas to know whether that has consequences, but I know my children graduates of Beaconsfield High School. They have a very dynamic community liaison officer, and she has people out doing high teas with seniors or cleaning up the community or doing 1,000,001 volunteer things to make sure that they have as rich as high school experience as possible. If this change just means it's not a requirement anymore, but that the service centers can still do it, may not have a big consequence, but if it has a funding consequence, it could be very important. So that, as I say, we went to Quebec City, and it became, I'm very proud of it, but it was a bit strange because my son was sitting on the committee, and it's, you know, I'm a dad, I'm very proud of my son. One correction, Linton, my son went out and got the nomination. I didn't hand anything off to my son. And the advice I got from everybody was, stay out of it. It's not your show anymore, so everyone, because I was tempted, you know, to phone my boss and say, you got a good candidate, but don't do that. But my son went out and did the necessary things, met people in the community, and I can be far from objective about the work he's done so far, but I'm very proud of him. That I can say as a dad. And so I was a bit startled when the Liberal critic, Marwa Risky, said, greetings, Mr. Kelley, but instead of asking you questions, I'm going to ask the M&A for Jacques Cartier to ask you questions. So it was one of those kind of moments that I'll never forget. But having said that, I think APPELLE, I know QFHSA presented an excellent brief. Congratulations, Dan, and to your team. That was really well done. The advisory board soon will be coming up with a document that we'll be able to access. I know Home and School is working on a brief. Other voices have been heard as well. I think the Association of Administrators presented a brief as well. But there have been very few voices of the English community heard. Maybe half a dozen or something like that. I don't have the exact score with me. So working with both QFHSA and the QCGN, we hope to hold an event on the 19th of November, which is a week Tuesday, where we will gather up comments, briefs from groups and promise to send them to Stephen Colpitts, put them on his desk. No, we'll send them to the parliamentary committee looking at this. We'll send it to the minister's office as well, because there are a lot of concerns out there. And as I say, to my initial remarks to the government, you know, has decided that they want to be known as the government that said they're going to do this, they're going to do it as quickly as possible, and damn the consequences. And on something that is such a fundamental issue as this, that's a very poor approach. And the process, the bill was tabled October 1st. The hearings started October 29th, and the whole thing has to be done by December 6th because some of the provisions on the French side have to go into effect at the end of February. And the National Assembly adjourns on December 6th. I told my son to bring an extra shirt because no doubt on December 7th or December 8th, the National Assembly will sit in an extraordinary session and closure will be used to get the bill through because it's, as I say, it's almost 300 articles of legislation. The hearings aren't over yet. There are 4 weeks left in the National Assembly before it rises for at the end of 2019. So I just don't think all 3 parties of the opposition are opposed to the legislation. So those parties will want to take their time to express their views. So I don't see how this bill could be adopted by the normal procedures by the 6th of December. But I've been wrong before. But it is something. So I think it's at La Nouvelle Hotel from the 1st to from 1 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the afternoon. You can go to the APPELLE website or the Facebook page for more details about this, or I'll be around afterwards if you want more information about it. But finally, as I say, the final point is, both as an M&A and now as the chair of APPELLE, I really want to be able to say at the end of this process, I did everything in my power to avoid a court case. Because a court case will create a period of uncertainty. The issues involved are important not just for the English-speaking community of Quebec, but for the Francophone minorities across the country. Because if you're a Franco-Yukonien or whatever, these issues, the same principles apply. So they'll be watching it quite carefully. Our allies in the Canadian School Board Association are looking at this quite carefully as well, because we're not the only province that's had this debate. Nova Scotia and other provinces have gone through similar kinds of debates. So there are very important principles in here. And I believe in universal suffrage. I believe in local democracy. I believe that it's very important that we maintain those principles. If you want to call it inside a service center, if you want to call it inside of a school board, I'm less attached to that, but to the powers and to the ability, particularly of a minority, a linguistic minority, to participate in the control and management of our schools. I think that's a fundamental principle that's worth fighting for. So I got out of the comfortable white chair. I've gone to lots of meetings. I've been seeing lots of Sylvia and Geoffrey and Dan and Russell and Carol and Linton and all sorts of friends. So it's been an interesting process. And I go back to when we read Bill 40 for the first time. The willingness to imagine a different outcome for the English-speaking community is an opening. But what is on the table right now, I just think won't work. And on practical terms, November 1st, 2020 will be a mess. But more importantly, raises essential constitutional questions that have to be examined much more carefully. We only have 4 weeks left. With the response the minister gave me, we have a long way to go, because a service center board just be there to make sure that the procedures were followed is not control and management. And that, as I say, our lawyers are chomping at the bit. They want to go. To me, $1 million is still a lot of money, or $2 million is still a lot of money. Our schools could all use that money as opposed to debating these important principles in the court, but it is one of the potential outcomes. But as I say, just in closing, I want to be able to say at the end of the day that I tried everything possible to find a different solution, to find a political solution, so that your participation in the education of your children, my participation in the education of my grandchildren now, is something that is respected, because I'm a failed educator. I was a teacher here at John Abbott for a couple of years. Jobs were scarce, so I opted for the job security in politics. So there you go. But it worked. So it wasn't a bad career strategy, but I loved teaching. I'll be doing a bit of teaching at McGill in the new year, so I'm looking forward to all of that very much. But these are fundamental questions. These are things that, to our place in Quebec society as an English-speaking minority, are fundamental. So thank you to the allies in the room. Thank you for listening to me. I'm more than willing to answer questions, because it is really complicated. And I've tried to do the best I can to make something simple, but c'est pas évident. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
That was excellent. So there may be some of you who do have questions, so please, go ahead and ask, because this is a complicated process and something that's got a lot of people concerned, and you need to be able to inform your membership about what really is going to be happening. So here's the time to be able to find out information.
One big question.
Yeah.
We see this Bill 40 as, basically, we see it as failing. It's going to fail, has nothing to do with student success. And that's where we come in. For us, student success is the most important part of our being, and we see nothing in this Bill 40 that will help in student success in any way.
Thank you, Rosemary, for that oversight on my part. One of the points we made in the brief, of course, is in the current form, our English public schools perform well. They have graduation rates that are above the provincial average, so we have, and it's not perfect. I won't rest until we get to 100%, but that's probably unrealistic. But we have made significant progress. Kate knows these numbers much better than I do, but over the last 10, 15 years, the school success rates have continued to climb in the English schools. There's some that still need more help. We still have a long way to go. As Minister of Indigenous Affairs in Quebec for many years, we have Indigenous school boards that need an extra hand as well because they have huge challenges. But my work I did with the Cree School Board, for example, it's coming. You know, it's still a ways to go, but the numbers are more encouraging than they were 15 years ago. And, you know, it's the old English cliche, but it's often a very good one. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, and if we have a system where parents such as you feel motivated to go and volunteer in your school and put a little extra effort into the education of your children, bravo. And I think that's something, the link between our school governance and the community and the volunteers is part of that success story. And I just remember my children went to Beacon Hill Elementary School, and it's got it's small, but a lovely library. And it was the kind of thing that the parents and the homeschool and everyone went out, and we bought lots of scholastic books and all the things that parents are supposed to do. So there were extra books left over. Often volunteer parents would go in to make sure that the school library, another confession on my part, I like books, like a little bit too much, my wife says, and there are books everywhere. That's another issue for another day, but books to me are an essential part of education. And yes, we can read our Kindles, and my kids say, Dad, buy Kindles, but no. But we need books. We need to excite children about learning things. Very bravely, my wife and I looked after our 4 grandchildren for a week while our daughter and son-in-law celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in California. It's a good idea to have kids in your 20s and 30s, eh? It really is a good idea, because when you're in your 60s, you know, it was a bit of a challenge. But just sitting down with my 6-year-old grandson and an atlas, we could spend hours, you know. Granddad, show me Ireland. Show me where Uncle Stephen lives. And Granddad, where's Italy? And, you know, you just go on and on. But you need the books, you need the paper, and you need dedicated people like you in the room to help share that adventure with young people. So you're quite right. Our systems are working. As I say, I'm a very proud defender of all public schools. I am a product of an English public school, as are my children and grandchildren. And the seeds of that success are things that are worth protecting. Yes. Oh, sorry, Rosemary, the one behind you. And I'll come back to you, Rosemary.
I'm part of the Western Quebec Board on the governing board at CSRC and I'm just kind of thinking in the future, not the whole year, but if it does move forward, let's say. Mm-hmm. Right now, Darcy said every weekend, I'll want grant money. I'm sure where else does as well. Does that basically freeze anything that could potentially come in to schools if it were to go forward because there was no decision to be made?
You're asking me to speculate on. Yeah, I can't. I had trouble hearing it too. So, Brian, you're not alone. My understanding is, were there to be a court case, what would things like special funding, allocations, and everything else like this? I can't really answer your question honestly. I would assume, the courts would have to make certain decisions, but the funding of schools would have to carry on because the schools would have to go. So I don't think the uncertainty is less on the day-to-day level, but it would still create an element of uncertainty because you'd be waiting. If it were a normal course of things, you would go to the Quebec Superior Court and plead your case and render a decision, and because important issues are raised, if one side or the other was unsatisfied with the outcome, you would go to the Quebec Court of Appeal and you'd plead the cases again, and that would take a certain amount of time. And if one of the parties is not happy with the outcome, you have the potential of going to the Supreme Court. And if you look at, I think the most celebrated case in terms of linguistic school rights was the Mahe case in Alberta in 1990, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was the question of Francophone parents in Alberta wanting to have a school. So it was a long process. They eventually won the day, and many of the principles I talked about today come from the Mahe decision. There have been a series of other decisions. So, I mean, obviously in the day-to-day, you have to keep schools going. But for the careers of the teachers, the professionals, for all of that, you would inevitably create a zone of uncertainty. Is this permanent, or might this get turned back, and all the rest of it? It costs a lot of money. So to me, and I can draw a parallel to my role as working in Indigenous affairs as well, much better an agreement that you worked out with the chiefs at the table than going to court. Because the court sagas are very long, they're very expensive. For Indigenous communities, they don't have millions of dollars to spend on these kind of questions. And if they do, they're taking them out from other budgets for desperate needs. So I keep that in the back of my mind. We have to find a political solution, because both the cost and the uncertainty that a court case would create would be unfortunate. But having said that, I try to look at Bill 40 and try to see how November the 1st could work, how November the 1st could be something where all of us in the room still felt we had a say, that we mattered, that our participation in the electoral process will make a difference, and I don't see it. And I'm not speaking just for myself. The bulk of the briefs that were presented by QFHSA, by the other groups, come to the same conclusion, that the real powers that these new service centers will be able to exercise are very limited. The process of choosing them, too complicated, and many of the constitutional principles are not respected. So we have a big problem, but I'm, at the end of the exchange, I spoke to the minister, I spoke to the deputy minister. APPELLE is more than willing to sit down. QFHSA has made the same offer to look at alternatives, to look at ways we might be able to fix this. So I'll remain committed to finding a political solution till the last moment, and to say that as part of this group, and it's great, it's the first time I've had a chance to work with Joan Fraser, who was a senator for 10 years. She was the editor-in-chief of the Gazette. She's a remarkable woman, so smart, so observant. It's really been a joy working with her. Kevin Shar is, as I say, a young lawyer, works for the federal government, lives in Gatineau, has 2 daughters, and he brings that real perspective of getting his daughters to their various activities and this and that. And for him, as a parent who would like to get involved, it's kind of difficult. They live in Wakefield, their children go to school in Gatineau itself, so there's a big commute in the morning to get them to school. Anyway, all complicated to say, that's the reality. I look at my own daughter and 4 children, and after a week, I was done. I don't know, but it was just, whoa. So, but that's the parent's reality, and you have to take that into account when you make expectations on how much we expect from parents in this new model. Rosemary, you had another question.
Yeah, well, it wasn't really a question, it's more a feeling, I guess. Do whatever you can for the English side, I appreciate that, but I really feel sorry for the Francophone side, because it's gone back to 1848 for them, taxation with no representation. So anybody that's retired, anybody that has no children left in the system, they'll have no say over taxation of their school boards, or whatever, their schools, sorry. And I don't know how much power their service centers will have over taxation, but unless they start screaming and yelling, it would be nice if they could use that to help us on our side too.
No, and as I say, I go back to my experiences at MNA. There were 2 school boards on my territory, Lester B. Pearson and Commission Scolaire Marguerite Bourgeois. I had excellent relations with them. They do a fine job, and I have nothing but respect. If I limited my comments today to the English side, that's a bit the mandate that APPELLE was given. But I have great support and sympathy for the cause of the Fédération des Commissions Scolaires du Québec. Their battle is somewhat different, but I support them 100% because I still believe firmly between, with all due respect, Stephen, the ministry in Quebec City and the school, to have an intermediate is something that's very important to help to make sure. Take, for example, in the past, we've asked to develop policies about bullying. Well, the grand principles are set in Quebec City, and we think this is something important, and the provincial government's willing to fund it. But an anti-bullying program in Pointe Claire will be different from an anti-bullying program in Gaspé or in Chisasibi. And to make sure that there's someone in between the two that can work those things out, how to best serve students with special needs is something as well that can have different variations in different communities, different resources that are available. So to allow that middle role, someone to make sure the resources as best they can, because we always know the needs outstrip the resources that are available, but to try to make sure that it's spread as fairly as possible across the territory, I think is something important. And the other thing that I mention all the time, because it is a great proof of the link between school boards and the community, was 50 years ago. We were into anniversaries, the development of the French immersion programs, which was a school board initiative. It didn't come from Quebec City, it came from the school boards. Parents told their school boards, if we want our children to have a chance to stay and to grow in Quebec, their French language skills have to be better. I was too old for French immersion. My youngest brother, Mark, was one of the first ones at Christmas Park Elementary School down the way. Despite years of living in Toronto, working for that big national broadcaster, his French is still excellent. So he got a leg up that I didn't get from those French immersion programs. But those are one of the signal school board success stories in Quebec. And they're the proof of that, as I say, synergy between the school boards and the communities that they serve. And I think it's you can put that showcase in the window as their #1 success story. And so far, so good. 5 kids, they all live in Quebec. So there you go.
Any final questions? Yes, Carol?
It's pretty clear from everything in Bill 40 that none of it seems to address student success.
Again, I think it's even more complicated than that because there is a requirement in the bill to create a student success committee, but there are no elected officials on it. So it's only within the educators, the professionals, but there is no community voice on the school success committee, that is set out in Bill 40 to the best of my recall. Anyway, enjoy the coffee. I'm not going anywhere, so if you have any further comments, but it's that time of the morning where we all probably need to stretch our legs and have a nice cup of coffee. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, Geoffrey, we just want to present you, you talked about your grandchildren.
Yeah.
So we're going to present you with a little book that you can use to read with your,
Will
with
do
your
for sure.
grandchildren and enjoy a little bit about the history of the achievements here at the Federation.
Great to see you. Great to see you, my man.
Thank you all.